welcome to New England Authors. It's very good to have you here. We have a new guest every week, and we're trying to find out some of the interesting people that make our region vibrant. And today our guest is Elisabeth Elo. Welcome, Elisabeth. Your debut novel, which was called North of Boston, was listed by Booklist as the best debut novel, and you hold a PhD in American literature from Brandeis, right?
That's correct.
All right, so let's start with, I know you have a new book out that we really want to discuss, and I found it very interesting. Let's start with North of Boston. It features a Russian-American Piero Kasparov, right?
Yes.
Everybody who plays chess knows Kasparov, and she survives 4 hours in the icy waters off of New England. Did you get a lot of flack from people who say, oh, that's an impossible task?
Well, you know, I did a lot of research for the book, and among the things I researched was the body's reaction to very, very extreme conditions.
Yeah.
In this case, very cold water. And it turns out that it's not really known exactly how much the human body can endure, and that there are some people who have greater physiological resistance to certain things, such as cold water.
So it's possible, this 4 hours?
It is, and in fact, the Navy does a lot of research about this because they're always looking into how to, you know, survival tactics and survival in extreme conditions. So they actually do research on this very subject.
Right. Isn't that wonderful about being an author, is you get to explore things that you never thought would be possible?
That's one of the things I love about writing, and I get into a subject a little way, and then I keep going, and I look at what's possible. And as it turns out, there has been also research on sled dogs.
On sled dogs, yeah.
You see how easily I get off topic very quickly. But they run for, you know, many, many miles in the very cold, and for some reason physiologically they don't ever get tired, and they, you know, the sled dogs, they just keep going and going and going.
Yeah.
So the Navy actually has studied them to find out how they managed to do that amazing feat.
Now, there's another interesting part of this book. It's about perfume, right? There's
Yes.
And she has an extremely sensitive sense of smell. Is that personal? Do you? Or?
I don't think so, but there did come a time in my life where I had been wearing the same fragrance for years and years.
Yeah.
And I thought, I think it's time for me to change. So my daughter, who was just maybe a teenager, a new teenager at the time, she and I went on a quest to find the best perfume. And we ended up speaking to a lot of people who make perfume and who sell it. And there was a lot of interesting stories that came out of that. And they all found their way into this book.
Now you didn't write a sequel to it.
I did not, no.
Because?
Well, I think the publisher would have liked me to have written a sequel because the character was so loved. Everybody wanted to hear and have another book about her. But I tried writing it, and it just didn't work. I felt that the book was dull, and the voice sounded fake, and I couldn't bring the same amount of energy to it. And I think that for me, a book and a character and a plot go together, sort of hand in glove, and each character has her own story.
Yes.
And this was Piero's story, and there really wasn't another one.
Yeah, okay, well that's great, because you came out with a really nice book, which I found really fascinating, Finding Katerina M, and M stands for
Melnikova.
Melnikova, and the story starts out, I'll say how it starts out. It starts out with someone coming into a doctor's office, a woman doctor's office in Washington, D.C., and says that the grandmother of the doctor, who everybody thought had died in Stalin's gulags, was actually alive, and that she was also a granddaughter, so they were cousins, in fact, right? And she's a ballet dancer who just happened to come to the United States to, have I got the story right,
You
the beginning?
definitely have it right,
yeah.
yes.
And then she desperately wants to stay in this country.
Right.
Right. And then lo and behold, she gets murdered that night.
Right. She asks for, Natalie is the doctor,
Natalie,
and
yeah.
she's very devoted to her profession. She's a very sane, rational, thoughtful, dedicated, hardworking person.
Yes.
And this young woman comes to her office and says, I'm your cousin, and our grandmother is alive, and she lives in a small village in Siberia. And Natalie is stunned by this because Natalie's own mother has always believed that she was an orphan. And so she knows that this is incredibly important information for her mother and also for her. But the young woman says to her later, she said, you know, what I really want is your help to defect or to stay in this country.
Yeah.
And Natalie is a very law-abiding person.
Yeah.
She thinks this is a terrible idea because she knows how hard it will be for this young woman, barely speaking English, to become an illegal alien in the United States.
Right.
So she talks her out of it, and then finally she says, well, look, I'll think about it, and I'll come to your performance, and we'll talk about it again when I get there. And in the meantime, she plans to talk to immigration lawyers and other people so she can help this woman without breaking the law. Mm. And I think she's secretly hoping that she can talk her into going home. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, before that takes place, the young woman ends up murdered in her hotel room.
Yeah. So both these books feature a very strong female character. They tell a story. They tell their story in the first person, and in fact, I think they get stronger as the novel progresses. I'm not going to give the story away. See, so most of the story takes place in the town in Siberia, in a town called Yakutsk.
Yes.
Am I pronouncing that?
Yeah, Yakutsk.
And I don't know much about Siberia or anything about Siberia, but I looked it up, and Siberia is huge. It's really, and it's very far north. This is really far north, and it's actually east of Peking, Beijing. Right, it's near the Pacific Ocean. Right. Did you go there?
I did go there, and if for listeners who want a visual image of where Yakutsk is, if you've ever played the board game Risk, then you'll remember that there's this huge Russian expanse, and somewhere in the middle there's a tiny dot. There's one city, which appears to cover, in an area that seems to cover half the globe, and that's Yakutsk. And it's very remote, and in fact, in the winter, the only way you can get there is either by plane or by driving on the frozen river, because the regular roads are so impassable.
So there is a river, the Lena River, that goes up to the Arctic Circle, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Lena River passes through Yakutsk, and Yakutsk is actually a city that has an amazing history. It used to be a gold mining place. It's now filled with diamonds, and there's a lot of corporations there. People are making a lot of money there, but the people who live there all the time, of course, aren't necessarily seeing those profits trickle down to them.
Right.
And so there's a lot of poverty as well. And there are a lot of native groups in the area. And the one native group that I met and that I spent some time with was the Saha, S-A-K-H-A, and they are actually a Turkic people who immigrated years, I don't know, hundreds or perhaps 1,000 years ago to this one area, and they were very warm and welcoming, when I was there.
So there's something else there. It's the woolly mammoth, right?
Oh,
There's
yes.
a museum of the woolly mammoth. We had an exhibit here at the Museum of Science. Adorable creatures. They only went extinct, I think, about 11,000 years ago, if I remember right. They're, everybody wants to see a woolly mammoth. So tell us now. You went there. What's it like? What's Siberia like?
Well, as a Westerner, I grew up in Boston. I've lived here most of my life, and so for me to go to Siberia was a very big culture shock. I knew that if I were going to write about this place, I had to see it myself. I think that there are certain places that you can write about without having been there. For example, I think I could probably write about Paris, maybe not very well, but we know it, we've seen it in films, we know a little bit more of the culture. But to write about Siberia is just it's a whole different world, literally, and it's so different in so many ways that the only way that I could see myself writing about it is if I actually traveled there. So when I got there, I realized, well, first of all, I think Westerners have all kinds of negative images of Siberia.
Yes.
Based on the history, the Gulag history.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
The idea that Siberia is a place where you're sent when you're being punished, when you're being exiled, that it's cold, it's dark, it's lonely, it's vast. People, millions of people actually died there.
Yes.
In the most horrible circumstances. And yet the Trans-Siberian Railroad was bringing a lot of natural resources back to Moscow, which helped fuel the industrialization of Russia. For example, timber and tin and all these resources were flowing back.
Yeah.
But the people who were producing them, were just dying like flies.
Yeah.
So it's a terrible place for me to think about it. I thought of it as a terrible place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you were there,
then you go there and you realize it's just, the history
nice people.
The history is long ago.
The town of Yakutsk looks like a very modern city.
Absolutely is. Yeah. It sky-rise, high-rise buildings and gracious old Russian, administrative offices that are beautiful. The pre-Soviet. Some of the pre-Soviet architecture, and then of course you have the Soviet architecture, which is these tall, soulless concrete.
Yes.
Just miles of them, it seems. And so it's combining all these various influences, and it's a modern city, and just shopping malls and people coming in and out, and tourists and.
So Katarina. In fact, was sent to the gulags, right, by Stalin's government, and she escaped.
She did.
Yeah, she ran away. Everybody thought she died because everybody would die, but her husband didn't make it, but she made it, right?
Right.
Was that common? Do you know? Yes.
I think it was. Well, I don't think anybody knows for sure. First of all.
Yes.
But I think it was fairly rare, because the distances were so vast that even if you escaped, where would you go? Mm-hmm. And people would just starve. And also Stalin, I didn't realize this, was very aggressively pursued escapees, and they would be tracked back to their homes. So there was a huge push to get escapees back to the Gulag.
Yeah.
So you would think, why would they care that much? You know what I mean? But apparently they did. It was unusual. But I want to mention one book, which is Anne Applebaum's Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Gulag, and it's a huge, exhaustive history of the Gulag. It's probably the best source of information that I was able to find, and she does a tremendous job of explaining so many facets of this.
Yeah. So this is New England Authors, and we record here in Cambridge and broadcast to stations around the region. So soon enough, this American woman goes there, and she speaks Russian because she's Russian heritage, and she ends up being recruited by the CIA, right? And has no training and is asked to do certain things. Did you research the CIA too?
I never really learned any of the inner workings of the CIA.
Right.
But I pulled some things together, and one is the idea that apparently, what do I know, but apparently I've read that the CIA does use people, civilian people, for certain things.
Yes,
and I know that for example, MI6 used to have, or perhaps possibly still has, what they call support agents, where they will have civilians doing little jobs for them. And so that's really what happens to Natalie when she goes to Siberia.
Yeah.
She finds herself being asked to do something that seems very simple. All she has to do is go and make some inquiries about a person, her cousin, and see what people tell her, and then report back to her handler at the CIA. And it seems like a simple thing.
Yes, but then she really gets into it. She's very effective, isn't she?
Is.
She becomes a really good spy, too good of a spy, right? And we're again introduced to gulags. We're introduced to chemicals, dangerous chemicals. We're including like sarin gas, radiation, mass graves, and so were you trying to link? You don't say very good things, or your characters don't say very good things about Putin. Were you trying to link Putin to Stalin?
I didn't do that consciously.
Yeah.
No, but there is a sense of fear, I think, and control.
In Putin's world.
Yeah.
Well, it's really hard to know about dictators, but I understand he's very popular.
Well, if you go to Siberia, in Siberia, Siberia it's almost a different country. It's a different region. Mm-hmm. There are ethnic Russians, but a large portion of the population are native peoples. And I think that their sense of how Russian they are may be different from people in Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Yes.
So they don't necessarily, my impression was that they don't necessarily relate or identify as strongly with Putin's government.
Well, it's a world. Moscow is how many lights?
Maybe 9 time zones away.
9 time zones away. Incredibly large country. So,
there's a Siberian folk or saying that says, God is far up and the Tsar is far away. That's where they are. They're far away from all the authorities.
So I want to quote one of your characters who says, "Until we Russians face our history," meaning the history of the gulags, we'll never go forward. Tell us, how does that? What's the meaning of that?
Well, this actually started with my daughter's ballet dancer. A ballet teacher, who, and I don't want to I'm not going to say her name or tell any stories about her, but she became very interested in reading my daughter's history books to find out what American history books were saying about Russia. And I think that she was learning about her own country by reading American history books that high schoolers were reading. And that was the first time it dawned on me that this history of the Gulag is not as well known in Siberia and Russia as it is here. And in fact, when I visited in Siberia, when I tried to bring up the subject, it was not something that anybody wanted to talk about. It quickly was shut down. And in this book, there is a scene in which Natalie tries to raise the subject, and people said, and someone says, we just don't talk about that.
Yeah.
And one of the other women that I knew who is from Siberia, an American from Siberia, just basically said, no, that didn't happen. Those were all convicts. So they were all prisoners, and they were there serving time for crimes.
Incredible.
So we have a different reality, I think.
Well, so when I read that quote, I started to think about our own history, American history, of slavery and the genocide of the American Indians, which we really haven't taken seriously either. We haven't owned up to that history.
Absolutely true. And I mean, I used to teach American literature, and I was always struck by how separately we treat, for example, African American literature from American literature, and how the history of race in this country is not as folded into the story of America as it should be.
I think it's better now. I think it was much worse when we were growing up.
Absolutely.
We were growing up to think of Indians as savages, and the white people bringing civilization. We're speaking with Elisabeth Elo. This is New England Authors. There's a wonderful book called Finding Katerina M. Her latest book, and her previous book was North of Boston. So anyway, your protagonist, Natalie, she gets arrested, charged with murder and espionage. The espionage is true, the murder is not. And she's sent to a prison. It's pretty much like she's living her grandmother's life of being incommunicado in a gulag. And I mean, would you mind if I give the story away a little bit? Not that she escapes. Well, obviously she escapes in order to tell the story, right? So she's like her grandmother, which escapes from a very unusual situation. Both survived, right?
Right.
Tell us a little about what she does. Don't give the story away.
You mean while she's in?
While and after, yeah.
Well, she's a doctor.
Well, yes, we know that, yeah.
So as a doctor, she finds a way to become more useful in the prison than a regular person. And that ends up being, an advantage to her. But just pulling back and looking at the book as a whole, one of the things I was interested in is when people become very skilled, for example, she's a doctor at the height of her profession, and she's very competent in a small environment, in the environment of the hospital. And she doesn't really venture out of that, not through any lack of curiosity, but simply because her profession is so demanding. So what I wanted to do was to say, take this person who's very successful in a small environment and then put them in something that they've never would have ever dreamed that they would experience. And that brings, of course, out facets of her personality that she didn't even know that she had.
Yeah. As I say, she becomes a strong person. There's another quote that I want to talk about. When she's in prison, I think one character says, well, it doesn't matter if it's true, meaning the charges. So there's a kind of a sense that justice doesn't matter. Is that right? And maybe I should ask it this way. Is it true that your book seems to bring justice where there isn't justice?
I don't know. I don't know about that.
Because in the end, justice is restored. In mystery books, justice is restored.
Right. Yeah. And that's the convention of the genre that you cannot play around with. This book plays a lot around with mystery and thriller, and it's a journey, it's an escape. There's all kinds of elements from different genres that are all woven into this book. But in the end, it has to restore some kind of order to the world. And so, yes, it does that.
What impression were you trying to give about Russia?
Well, I think I'm not sure that I am qualified to give an impression about Russia. I think that what I was trying to do was have someone face, Russia to us Westerners and Americans, it's a little bit of a foreign, mysterious, perhaps frightening place. It's a place we don't understand very well. It's almost a frontier. Siberia, I think, is more of a frontier than any other geographic location that I know of. Maybe Mongolia is more, but
this is north of Mongolia.
So I wanted to have, it's really a story about a Westerner who is facing a cultural difference and testing whether she was right or wrong about her assumptions. Yeah. And what she finds out is, and there's another line in this book where she makes a partnership with a doctor in the prison. Yes. And the two women, when they find each other and they find that they are both committed to curing diseases, they form a wonderful partnership. Yeah. And that to me was an important part of the book. Yeah. And also the other people that she met, who are basically humane, good people who want the same things that good people everywhere want. Yes. And she makes those connections. So
I know that you study fairy tales, right? How did this impact your book?
Well, I love fairy tales, and I love them for two reasons. One is that the narrative in the narrative structure of a fairy tale is so logical and clear, and it moves from, initiated incident to complications to the crisis, to the resolution in a very direct path. And I love that about them. But also, I really love the fact that they have such a blunt acknowledgement of evil. So the evil actor is in the book. Nobody in the fairy tale is analyzing why the person is evil. They're not trying to give any backstory. They're, to say that they were, unhappy children or anything. And I think that frees up the heroine a little bit to just think about surviving evil or think about what to do as response to it.
Yeah. Yeah, we're running out of time, so I want to ask you you write in different genres. What does genre mean to you, and what are you currently writing?
Oh, I think genre is just a bunch of conventions. For example, a literary novel has certain conventions. You expect certain things in a literary novel. You expect other things in a mystery, expect other things in a thriller. And the writer plays with those conventions, satisfying some of them, not satisfying others, so that the reader knows what to expect, but they're also a little bit surprised. And knowing the conventions is just part of writing in that genre.
Well, it's so good to have you on our show. Okay. This is a wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. This program is sponsored by the Curiosity Foundation. And this is Elisabeth Elo. And I'm Kameel Nasr. And remember, watch locally. Thank you.